Every evening, just after the 7:20 train crossed Marquette, Huxley stood by the door. The retired police K-9 was too old for secret missions, but too loyal to ignore a quiet cry. One night, Sergeant Mason Wycliffe followed him through the snow. 4 blocks later, they stopped at a small house with a blue blanket on the porch. Inside were 2 frightened German Shepherd puppies and a woman who had started living again because they needed her. Mason thought he had found a problem to fix, but Huxley had found a family no one could see yet. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like, share, and subscribe. The 7:20 train and the gap behind the fence. By the time Sergeant Mason Wycliffe turned onto Birch Harbor Lane, the snow had stopped pretending to be decoration. It had settled into the seams of the road, gathered along the curb, and softened the square shoulders of every mailbox on the block. Lake Superior lay somewhere beyond the roofs and bare trees, unseen from this part of Marquette, but always present in the cold. The wind that came off it carried a clean, metallic bite, the kind that found its way beneath a uniform collar, no matter how tightly a man fastened it. Mason parked in the narrow drive beside his house and sat for a moment with one hand still on the wheel. The engine ticked softly after he shut it off. His radio, finally silent, seemed to leave a shape in the air where voices had been all day. A noise complaint at a duplex, a welfare check where the resident had only forgotten to charge her phone, a minor crash near the grocery store because someone trusted old tires on new ice. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a report worth rereading. Still, Mason carried the day in his shoulders. He stepped out, shut the cruiser door with care, and looked once down the quiet street before heading inside. Habit, not fear. A police officer learned to look at empty spaces the same way other men looked at faces. Open curtains, dark porches, a car that had not moved since morning, a newspaper still on the step. Small things told the truth first. Inside the mudroom, warmth met him with the smell of old wood, dog fur, and the faint trace of coffee he had forgotten to pour out that morning. Mason removed his gloves, placed them on the shelf, and hung his dark navy patrol jacket on the second hook from the door. His badge caught the light before the fabric settled. He unclipped the radio mic from his shoulder, set it beside his keys, and rolled his neck once to release the stiffness at the base of his skull. From the kitchen came the slow scrape of nails on the floor. Huxley appeared in the doorway without hurry. The German Shepherd had once crossed parking lots like a command-given shape. At 9 years old, he still looked powerful, but the edges of that power had softened. Black and tan coat, broad dark saddle across the back, warm tan at the chest and legs, a silvering muzzle that had grown more noticeable each month. His right ear stood straight. The left tipped slightly outward from an old injury Mason no longer thought about until someone new asked. Huxley stopped 3 feet from him and looked up with calm, amber-brown eyes. "Don't start," Mason said. "I know I'm late." Huxley blinked. Mason bent and ran one hand along the dog's neck, feeling the familiar weight of the black leather collar beneath his fingers. The metal tag was scratched from years of use. Once, the collar had hung under a tactical harness with a clean K9 patch, and Huxley had worn it like work had a purpose simple enough for both of them to understand. Find, hold, wait. Now the commands were smaller, slow, easy. Enough. Mason moved into the kitchen, measured Huxley's joint medication into a spoonful of wet food, and set the bowl down near the mat by the radiator. Huxley ate with dignity, though not with the enthusiasm he once had. Mason watched long enough to make sure the pill disappeared, then opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it without seeing anything he wanted. The house was orderly because Mason kept it that way. Boots aligned beneath the bench, bills clipped by due date near the phone, extra batteries in a labeled drawer. Snow shovel by the back door, blade facing outward. Huxley's medicine arranged in a plastic weekly case beside the sink. Order made silence easier to live with. At 6:50, Mason heated soup in a small pot and ate standing at the counter. At 7:03, he washed the bowl. At 7:10, he checked the back lock. At 7:15, he pulled the blinds halfway down in the living room. not because anyone could see in from the street, but because that was what he always did. Huxley lay near the back door, head up. Mason noticed the posture but did not comment on it. The dog had been restless lately, and Mason had told himself that was normal. A retired K9 did not stop listening just because the work stopped calling. Huxley still lifted his head at sirens, still watched Mason lace his boots, still looked toward the cruiser on mornings when Mason left without him. Dr. Celia Arroyo had called it transition stress. Mason had nodded at the clinic, accepted the instructions, and ignored the way the word retired sat in the room like something that belonged to older men and dogs who had already finished being useful. At 7:20, the freight train sounded beyond the neighborhood. The horn moved across the rooftops in one long, mournful note, deep enough to tremble faintly through the kitchen window. It came every evening, near enough to mark time, far enough to become part of the town's breathing. Mason had heard it so often that most nights he no longer registered it. Huxley did. The dog rose before the sound faded. Not quickly, not with alarm, deliberately. He crossed the kitchen, nudged the back door with his nose, and waited. Mason looked over from the sink. "You need out?" Huxley did not paw, did not whine. He only stood there, ears angled toward the yard. Mason opened the door. Cold entered at once, sharp and clean. Huxley stepped onto the small back porch and down into the yard, his paws leaving dark impressions in the thin snow. Mason watched him pass the woodpile, circle once near the maple, and disappear behind the cluster of snow-heavy pines along the back fence. That corner had always been Huxley's place to inspect. Mason closed the door halfway and left the porch light on. 28 minutes later, claws tapped against the mudroom threshold. Mason opened the door and found Huxley standing there, breath a little faster than usual, expression composed. A red maple leaf was caught beneath the metal loop of his collar. Mason frowned. There were no red maples in his yard. He crouched and checked the dog automatically. Shoulders, ribs, hips, paws, no cuts, no swelling, no ice packed between the toes. Huxley tolerated the inspection with the patience of a partner who had endured worse procedures for better reasons. "Where'd you pick that up?" Mason murmured. Huxley looked past him toward the kitchen. Mason removed the leaf and held it between thumb and forefinger. It was damp, veined, torn at one edge. A small thing, maybe carried by wind, maybe dragged in by someone's tires, maybe nothing. Mason dropped it into the trash. The next night, the freight horn came through a light fall of snow. Huxley rose again and crossed to the back door. This time, Mason stepped onto the porch and watched longer. The dog went to the same corner, vanished behind the pines, and did not reappear when Mason called once, softly. For the first time, a different kind of cold moved through him. Not fear yet. Calculation. Mason pulled on boots and crossed the yard with a flashlight. The beam cut through the falling snow, catching on fence boards, low branches, the dull shine of frozen mud. He checked the gate first, latched. Then the side fence, solid. By the time he reached the pines, Huxley was already back at the porch. The dog stood under the yellow light, waiting. This time, there was red clay-colored mud between his toes. Mason knelt, touched it, and rubbed the grit between his fingers. The soil in his yard was dark and sandy beneath the snow. This mud had a copper tint. Hux. The dog's ears shifted at his name, but he offered no explanation. Mason cleaned his paws, more carefully than necessary, and slept badly. On the third evening, Mason did not turn on the television. He did not open the folder of community reports Lena Hartwell had left on his desk before he went off shift. He sat at the kitchen table with one hand around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, watching Huxley lie by the back door as if the dog had an appointment he intended to keep. At 7:20, the train horn passed through the house. Huxley stood. Mason was already moving. He opened the back door and followed as far as the porch steps. Huxley crossed the yard and slipped behind the pines. This time Mason saw it, a narrow shift in the dark, a board moving where no board should move. The dog pressed through the fence with the old confidence of a body that knew exactly how much space it needed. Then he was gone. Mason reached the corner too late to catch him. He pushed through the pine branches and found a loose fence board. Its lower nail rusted through, the gap hidden from the house by needles and snow shadow. From the porch, it looked solid. From here, it looked like a question he should have asked sooner. 31 minutes later, Huxley returned through the same place. Mason was waiting. He did not shout. That was not how he had trained the dog, and it was not how he treated old partners. He blocked the gap with his body as Huxley stepped back into the yard, then crouched in front of him. This time, the dog's muzzle carried the warm, grainy smell of puppy food. Mason closed his eyes for half a second. The mind offered possibilities too quickly. A stray litter, an irresponsible neighbor, someone feeding animals out of a garage, a child leaving food out, a house where an old dog had found company, a place he had not noticed, a person he had not checked on. That last possibility lodged under his ribs. Years earlier, before Huxley's muzzle had silvered, Mason had answered a call at a narrow house near the harbor. A man named Thomas Ivers had missed 2 appointments and failed to pick up a prescription. No one had reported it until the pharmacy tech recognized the pattern. Mason still remembered the untouched mail, the kettle on the stove, the chair angled toward a window that looked out on nothing in particular. The man had survived. Barely. What stayed with Mason was not the medical report. It was the thought of all the ordinary hours before anyone knocked. Since then, he had become the kind of officer who noticed uncollected newspapers, dark windows, and elderly residents who stopped waving from porches. People called him thorough. Some called him rigid. Both were true enough. He looked at Huxley now and saw not disobedience but insistence. The dog had found something. Or someone. The next morning, Mason went to the fence in daylight. The loose board was exactly where he had seen it, hidden behind the pines and a drift of snow blown against the bottom rail. He pulled it outward with 2 fingers. It gave too easily. A responsible man would have repaired it immediately. Mason was responsible. He also knew the difference between curiosity and evidence. If he nailed it shut without understanding where Huxley had gone, the answer would disappear behind silence. Still, he would not leave an open escape route for a 9-year-old dog with stiff joints and a habit of crossing streets after dark. So he compromised with caution. He wedged a heavy strip of scrap lumber across the gap, braced it with a metal toolbox, and tested it twice. Huxley would not be able to push through. Mason left the hammer and nails on the porch rail, ready if needed, then stood with his hands in his coat pockets and stared toward the street beyond the fence. He spent the rest of the day at work with the image of red clay mud between Huxley's toes. By evening, snow had thinned to a fine, glittering dust. The houses along Birch Harbor Lane glowed in tidy squares of lamplight. Mason came home, fed Huxley, warmed his medication between his palms before mixing it into the food, and waited without pretending not to. Huxley finished only part of his dinner. That worried Mason more than the fence. The dog had refused food only twice in all their years together. Once after a cracked tooth, once after a long search in sleet when both of them had come home shaking. Mason set the bowl aside and checked him again, eyes clear, gums healthy, no limp beyond the familiar stiffness, no tenderness in the abdomen. At 7:19, Huxley rose. The freight horn sounded a minute later. Mason opened the back door before the dog touched it. Huxley stepped into the yard, crossed to the pines, and stopped in front of the block gap. He sniffed the lumber once, then turned away. Mason stood on the porch, breath visible in the cold. Huxley did not search for another weak spot. He did not press at the fence, did not become agitated, did not look confused. Instead, he walked back across the yard, past the porch steps, and went straight to the sided gate. There, beneath the latch, the old German shepherd sat down. Then he looked back at Mason. No command had been given, no leash had been clipped, no emergency had been declared over the radio. Still, something in the yard changed. Mason felt it in the pause between the fading train horn and the quiet that followed. Huxley was not asking to escape. He was asking Mason to stop treating this like a breach in the fence and start treating it like a message. For a long moment, Mason did not move. He saw the dog as he had been at 5 years old, black harness tight across his chest, body coiled with discipline, waiting for a word. He saw him now, older, silver-muzzled, patient in the snow beneath the gate, still waiting for a word, but no longer for the same kind of work. Mason went inside. He took his dark patrol jacket off the hook, then stopped and put it back. Not tonight, not like that. From the lower peg, he took a plain winter coat, navy wool worn smooth at the cuffs. He slipped a small flashlight into one pocket, took Huxley's black leash from the drawer, and hesitated over the old K9 harness folded beneath it. The harness stayed where it was. He returned to the yard with only the leash in his hand. Huxley watched him approach, tail low, eyes steady. "I'm not steering this," Mason said quietly. "You show me." He clipped the leash to the collar but left it loose. Not tight enough to guide, only enough to keep the old dog safe near the street. Then he lifted the latch. The gate opened with a soft scrape against the frozen ground. Huxley stepped out first. Mason followed, closing the gate behind them. Ahead, Birch Harbor Lane curved south beneath a pale wash of streetlights. Snow clung to the hedges. The last vibration of the 7:20 train had faded from the rails, leaving the town washed in a silence that seemed too careful to be empty. Huxley moved forward at a slow, certain pace, not wandering, not searching, leading. Mason tightened his grip on the leash only enough to feel the living weight at the other end, and together they walked into the blue winter evening, toward whatever the old dog had decided Mason was finally ready to see. Huxley did not hurry. That was the first thing Mason noticed once they left Birch Harbor Lane behind. The old German shepherd moved with purpose, not urgency, his black leash hanging in a loose curve between them. He kept to the packed edge of the sidewalk where the snow was thinner, paused at each crossing, and lifted his head before stepping from curb to street. A younger K9 might have pulled toward scent, rushed through the cold with the confidence of a working animal certain of his target. Huxley did none of that. He walked like a dog who had already made the trip enough times to know which porch light flickered, where the pavement dipped under ice, and which yard held a motion sensor that would click on too late to matter. Mason followed with one hand in his coat pocket and the other around the leash. The town was quiet in the hour after dinner. Behind windows softened by frost, televisions moved in blue flashes. A woman in a red sweater carried plates from a table. Someone's Christmas lights, left up too long or put up too early, blinked along a gutter in tired green and white. The freight train had already passed, but its absence still seemed to hang over the roofs like a low note the neighborhood had not fully released. Huxley turned south after the fourth block. Mason knew the area, though not well. Harbor Row sat between the old rail spur and a row of low trees that screened the wind off Superior. It was a clean cluster of single-story homes built for older residents who still wanted independence but needed smaller steps, wider doors, and someone to clear the shared walks after storms. Mason had been there for welfare checks, smoke alarm calls, and one dispute over a parking space that had lasted longer than most domestic arguments. Harbor Row was the kind of place that looked safe on paper. Tidy porches, salted paths, names printed neatly beside doorbells, emergency contact forms on file in the office, too orderly to be overlooked, too quiet to invite concern. That thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Huxley crossed the entrance path beneath a wooden sign half covered in snow, then veered toward the third home on the left. A porch light glowed above a narrow door. Beneath it sat a wooden chair with weathered arms, a clay pot full of dead stems, and a blue wool blanket folded across the chair back, as if someone had meant to sit outside and changed her mind. The blanket caught Mason's attention before the footprints did. Small paw prints had marked the snow on the top step, some crossing over one another, some sliding where claws had lost purchase. A larger set, older and partly filled by fresh powder, stopped near the door. Huxley's. Mason felt the leash slacken completely. The dog stopped at the base of the steps, raised his muzzle, and waited. Before Mason could knock, a scramble erupted inside the house. Tiny nails skidded across a hard floor. Something bumped a table leg. Then came two barks, high and uneven, one sharp with excitement, the other softer and uncertain, overlapping in a way that made Huxley's ears tilt forward. The porch light brightened as the door opened. The woman who stood there was small but not fragile in the way people sometimes use the word. She wore a gray sweater over a pale blue house dress, thick socks, and soft brown slippers. Her white hair had been gathered into a loose knot at the back of her head, with a few strands escaping around a face lined by age and long practice at listening. One hand held a dish towel. The other rested on the edge of the door. She looked first at Huxley, not with surprise, with recognition. Then she looked at Mason, took in his plain winter coat, his posture, the leash in his hand, and the careful way he stood one step below her so he was not looming over the threshold. "So," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "you're the one he belongs with." Mason removed his hand from his pocket. "Sergeant Mason Wycliffe, Marquette Police." Her eyes narrowed a little, not with fear, but with caution. He added quickly, "I'm not here on a call. I'm here because my dog has apparently been visiting you without clearing it with me first." The corner of her mouth moved. "That sounds like him." "Huxley," Mason said. "I know." She glanced down. "I checked his collar the first night." Huxley had not climbed the steps. He remained where he was, waiting for permission as if the old working rules still mattered in someone else's doorway. The woman noticed. Her expression softened in a way Mason had not expected. "Come in, Huxley," she said. The dog climbed the steps. Mason followed only after she moved aside. Warmth met him first, then the smell of dish soap, old books, dry wool, and puppy food. The living room was small but orderly, lit by a lamp with a yellow shade near a window facing the shared lawn. A low bed made from folded towels sat beside the radiator. 2 shallow bowls had been placed on a rubber mat near the kitchen entrance. A bag of puppy food, folded carefully at the top and clipped shut, stood beside the counter. The first puppy arrived like a thrown mitten. She was all tan legs, oversized paws, and black-tipped ears that had grown faster than the rest of her. A faded yellow cloth toy dangled from her mouth. She slid on the wood floor, recovered, and rushed toward Huxley with no plan except joy. The second puppy came behind her. He stopped near the edge of the rug, amber eyes fixed on the older dog. His black and tan coat was softer, the dark saddle across his back only beginning to settle into its adult pattern. One ear stood while the other dipped at the tip, giving him a look of careful worry. "Nell is the thief," the woman said. "Scout is the thinker." Nell dropped the toy, snatched it up again, circled Huxley twice, then placed it between his front paws. Huxley lowered himself onto the rug. It took effort. Mason saw it in the controlled bend of the hips, the slight pause before the old dog settled fully. But once he was down, Huxley became still in a way that changed the room. Scout watched him for several seconds. Then the puppy folded his legs beneath himself and lay down too, close enough to feel the older dog's presence, not close enough to touch. Nell lasted another 10 seconds before pressing her shoulder against Huxley's neck. The woman exhaled, not dramatically, not for Mason, as if she had been holding one part of the evening until that moment. "I'm Miriam Bellwether," she said, folding the dish towel once, then again. "And before you ask, no, I did not steal your dog. I wasn't going to ask it that way. But you were going to ask." Mason looked at Huxley, then at the 2 puppies. "Yes, Mom." Miriam nodded toward a chair. "You can stand if you need to feel official, but the dogs settle faster when people sit." It was not quite a joke, and not quite an instruction. Mason sat. The chair was low, with arms polished by years of use. From there, he could see more of the room. A calendar hung on the refrigerator in the kitchen, the days marked with neat blue ink. Beside it, a veterinary appointment card had been held in place by a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. Under the appointment, a handwritten list divided the day into meals, short outings, naps, and something marked train. Mason's eyes stayed on that word a second longer than the others. Miriam noticed. "They don't like the freight horn," she said. "Scout especially. Any reason?" She settled into the chair near the radiator, moving carefully but without asking for help. "Tessa thinks it started the day they were brought in. The family had them in a crate in the back of a van near the church lot. Train went by just as they were being handed over. Big sound, strange hands, cold air. That is enough for some creatures. Tessa? Tessa Markham, church volunteer. Works with the Great Lakes Working Dog Transition and Rescue Network when they can get her to sleep between emergencies. Miriam smoothed the towel across one knee. A young family brought these two to a food distribution. New apartment wouldn't allow dogs. Tessa had no room at the rescue, no foster home ready, and a storm coming. She asked if I could keep them 72 hours. Mason glanced at the puppy food, the towels, the calendar. That was 2 weeks ago? 16 days. There was no embarrassment in the correction, only precision. I called Harbor Row the first week, Miriam continued. The office had a temporary clerk. He said a few days didn't require formal paperwork. Then the manager took medical leave. Tessa called twice to say the rescue was still full, and by then Nell had learned where I keep the dish towels. As if summoned by her name, Nell lifted her head, cloth toy mashed under her chin. She has no respect for linen, Miriam said. Mason almost smiled. Almost. He turned his attention back to the room, not searching for violations, but unable to stop assessing. The water bowl was clean. The mat beneath it had been wiped recently. Electrical cords were lifted away from chewing height. A folding gate blocked the hallway. The towels in the dog bed were old but clean. Nothing smelled sour. Nothing suggested neglect. Quite the opposite. This house had been rearranged around need. Mason knew what neglect looked like. He had seen dogs left in frozen yards, medication bottles untouched, rooms where no one had opened a window in weeks. This was not that. Miriam Bellwether had not failed to care. That made the situation more complicated. 4 meals? He asked, nodding toward the refrigerator. Small ones. Dr. Arroyo's office wrote it down after their first visit. Nell eats like someone told her the bowl might vanish. Scout forgets the bowl if Nell moves too quickly. You've had them checked? Of course. There it was. Not a fence exactly. A line drawn. Mason looked down. Huxley's eyes were half closed. Scout had shifted closer and now lay with his chin inches from Huxley's front leg. Nell's toy rested against the old dog's paw like an offering that had been formally accepted. When did Huxley first come here? Mason asked. 5 nights ago. Mason kept his face still. The train went by, Miriam said, and the puppies lost their minds. Scout backed under that table. Nell barked until she sounded angry at herself for being frightened. I opened the inside door to look out after the worst of it passed, and there he was on the mat. Huxley came to the door. No, he was lying down. She pointed with the folded towel. Right there, not asking to come in, not leaving either. Mason looked toward the entry mat. He let you check his collar? He gave me the impression I was allowed. That did make him smile briefly. Miriam's gaze moved to Huxley with the kind of respect people usually reserved for a neighbor who had shown up during a storm and never mentioned it afterward. I opened the screen. He came in, lay where he's lying now, and did nothing. That was the miracle of it. He did absolutely nothing. Scout came out from under the table. Nell stopped barking because no one was agreeing with her. 20 minutes later, both were asleep. Mason studied the old dog. Huxley did not look proud. He did not look caught. He looked tired, patient, and settled, as if this small room belonged to the evening in the same way the radiator warmth and weak lamp did. Miriam leaned forward and opened a blue cloth-covered notebook from the side table. Mason expected addresses, phone numbers, maybe feeding notes. Instead, he saw pages filled in narrow handwriting. Nell, steals towel before second meal. Scout, startles at plow noise but recovers faster if lamp is on. Train 7:20, Huxley arrived, 7:23. Scout stopped shaking after 4 minutes. Nell brought yellow toy to Huxley. Huxley left 7:51. Waited at door until both puppies were asleep. Mason read the last line twice. The room had an answer in it now, but not the kind he knew how to use. Huxley had not been wandering. He had been keeping appointments. Not with a handler, not with a command, with need. A sound rose faintly beyond the glass. At first it was only metal beneath distance. Then the horn came, lower and more broken by the walls than it had sounded from Mason's kitchen. Scout jolted upright. Nell sprang to her feet, barking once toward the window, then again toward nothing at all. Miriam placed one hand on the arm of her chair but did not stand. "Easy," she said, though her voice carried more hope than authority. Scout backed toward the table. Nell's paws skidded as she turned in a tight circle. Huxley lifted his head. He did not bark, did not rise, did not look to Mason for direction. The old dog simply breathed in, slow enough that Mason noticed the movement of his ribs, then turned his muzzle slightly away from Scout, making himself less direct, less demanding. Scout froze. The puppy's ears flicked toward the train, then toward Huxley. He took one step forward, then another, and lowered himself beside the old dog. Nell barked twice more. Her whole body seemed too full of the sound to contain it. Then she seized the yellow toy, rushed to Huxley, and shoved it against his shoulder, as if bringing proof that she had survived the terrible thing. Huxley rested his chin beside the toy. The freight cars rolled somewhere beyond Harbor Row, their rhythm traveling through the boards like weather. Miriam's hand relaxed on the chair arm. Mason did not speak. For years, he had trusted action because action could be measured. A door forced open, a person located, a report filed, a hazard removed, but this was something else. Huxley had crossed 4 blocks after a train horn because 2 young dogs needed calm before fear became habit, and an old woman needed another living creature to help hold the room steady. No statute covered that. No department policy explained it. When the sound faded, the house became almost tenderly quiet. Nell pressed along Huxley's side. Scout's eyes drooped. Miriam closed the notebook and looked at Mason, not pleading, not defending herself, waiting. Mason stood because sitting had begun to feel too intimate for a man who had arrived uninvited. "I should get him home," he said. Huxley did not move immediately. That, more than anything, told Mason how familiar this place had become. Miriam pushed herself up from the chair. One hand went to the armrest first, then to the side table. Her knees straightened slowly. She turned toward the kitchen. "I'll get him some water before he goes. You don't have to. I know." She walked to the counter with careful steps, filled a bowl, and carried it back with both hands. The bowl trembled slightly, not enough to spill, but enough for Mason to see the effort. Huxley rose and drank. Scout followed as far as the edge of the rug. Nell remained with the toy pinned beneath one paw. Mason watched Miriam lower the bowl to the floor and then brace her fingers against the table before standing fully again. The question he had been avoiding came into focus with a weight that had nothing to do with suspicion. This house was clean. These puppies were fed. Miriam Bellwether was not careless, confused, or cruel. She had given Scout and Nell warmth, routine, and attention. She had given Huxley a reason to leave home after the 7:20 train. She had given the room enough light for fear to pass through it without taking over. But Scout and Nell were still small enough to fit together on one towel. They would not remain small. Mason clipped Huxley's leash, thanked Miriam, and stepped back onto the porch. The cold struck his face. Behind him, 2 young barks rose once more, thinner now, not frightened so much as disappointed. Huxley paused on the top step and looked back through the open door. Miriam stood in the warm rectangle of light with the blue notebook tucked against her chest. Mason followed Huxley down to the snowy path, carrying with him the smell of puppy food, the sight of careful handwriting, and a question he knew would not leave him before morning. What happened when love was real, care was real, and still the future was larger than the room that held them? Mason did not sleep well after leaving Harbor Row. He told himself it was the coffee Miriam had offered and he had refused. Then he told himself it was the cold, the thin squeak in the back gate, the unfinished reports in his cruiser, the 3 missed calls from dispatch that had turned out not to be urgent. None of those explanations held. At 5:42 the next morning, before the first light had fully pressed against the windows, Mason stood in his kitchen with Huxley's medication in his palm and Miriam Bellwether's blue notebook still open in his mind. Huxley waited beside his bowl. The old dog had returned home quietly the night before. He had not pulled toward Harbor Row once they turned back onto Birch Harbor Lane. He had not resisted when Mason wiped his paws, removed his leash, or closed the door. That obedience should have made Mason feel better. It didn't. A dog could obey and still be asking a question. Mason mixed the medication into wet food and placed the bowl down. Huxley ate slowly. His ears lifted only once, at the scrape of a snowplow 2 streets over, then settled again. "You know this is complicated," Mason said. Huxley kept eating. "Of course you do." By 8, Mason was back at Harbor Row. He did not arrive in a patrol car. He parked his personal truck near the guest spaces and left his badge under his coat instead of clipped where it would catch the light. That decision did not make him less of a police officer. It simply reminded him that not every door needed the weight of the city standing on the porch. Miriam opened before he knocked twice. She looked as if she had been awake for hours. Gray cardigan, blue house dress, white hair pinned low, the same calm face. Behind her, Nell gave one bright bark and tried to squeeze around Miriam's ankles. Scout remained farther back, watching Mason first, then Huxley. "You came early," Miriam said. "I thought I should ask the questions in daylight. And are they different questions?" Mason almost answered too quickly. Then he said, "They should be." Miriam held the door open. Huxley stepped inside only after she moved aside. That small courtesy had become, somehow, the first rule of the house. Nell rushed toward him with the yellow cloth toy already in her mouth. Scout approached more slowly, his one dipped ear making him look permanently uncertain about whether hope was wise. Mason did not sit this time until Miriam did. It seemed important. He took the chair opposite her and pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. "I want to understand what you're doing for them." Miriam's expression changed by a fraction, not softened, not relieved, more like she had allowed him one step closer to a line but not across it. Then ask. So he did. How many meals? 4 smaller portions. 'Cause Nell ate too quickly and Scout lost focus if the room got busy. Vaccinations? First visit completed. Second scheduled for the following Wednesday. Dr. Arroyo's office had confirmed the appointment by phone. Outside time? Short outings after breakfast, mid-afternoon, and before dark. Miriam avoided the icy section near the mailbox because Scout slipped there once and disliked it now. Sleep? Nell fought it until she had stolen something soft. Scout settled if the lamp near the radiator stayed on. Any vomiting? No. Any coughing? No. Any resource guarding? Nell had strong opinions about dish towels, but surrendered food if Miriam traded calmly. Scout moved away from conflict before it started. Mason kept writing, though part of him had stopped needing the answers. Miriam was not guessing. She was not romanticizing. She had done what careful people did when love frightened them. She had turned it into notes, schedules, and small repeatable acts that should have reassured him. Instead, it made the future sharper. "What about February?" he asked. Miriam looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "February tends to arrive whether I approve or not. The shared walk freezes. The wind off the lake gets worse. These two will be stronger by then. I'm aware puppies grow. Nell already pulls toward motion. Scout backs away when he startles. If they move in opposite directions on ice, I said I'm aware." Her voice had not risen, but Nell stopped chewing the cloth toy. Scout lifted his head from Huxley's front leg. Mason lowered his pen. "I'm not questioning whether you care for them." "No," Miriam said. "You're questioning whether caring is enough." It was exactly what he was doing. Hearing her say it made the room feel smaller. Huxley lay between the 2 puppies, eyes open now. He had the stillness of an old officer in a crowded hallway, not intervening yet, only measuring whether the air needed him. Mason rested his notebook on one knee. "I have a fenced yard, space to work them separately. I know German shepherds. Huxley already steadies them. I could take both." Nell stood with the toy hanging from her mouth. Miriam did not move. "I wouldn't split them," Mason said. "You could visit. Anytime. I could bring them here when the weather allows. You'd still be part of their lives." He had arranged the offer before he finished speaking. 2 crates along the mudroom wall. A second food station by the back door. Morning work in the yard before shift. Short individual walks. Huxley supervising from the maple. Clean, safe, manageable. The answer was so reasonable that for one dangerous second, Mason expected gratitude. "No," Miriam said. The word did not come fast or loud. It came with the firmness of a door closing gently but completely. Mason waited for qualification. None came. "No," he repeated. "No, Miriam. You have been in my home twice," she said. "The first time because your dog brought you. The second time because you could not stop thinking about what might go wrong. You have looked at the bowls, the towels, the calendar, the gate, the floor. You have not yet asked what this house was like before they came." Mason's jaw tightened. He had, in fact, wondered. But wondering privately was not the same as asking. Miriam folded her hands over the blue notebook in her lap. "Before Scout and Nell, I could leave the curtains closed until nearly noon and no one would object. I could eat crackers over the sink and call it supper. I could let the kettle sit empty because making tea for one person sometimes felt like addressing an envelope to no one." The room became very still. Nell lowered the toy. "Now," Miriam said, "there are 2 bodies outside my bedroom door before sunrise. There are meals that must happen on time. There is water to check, towels to wash, a reason to open the back door and know whether the morning is clear or snowing. That may sound small to you, Sergeant, but small things are what most days are built from." Mason looked at Scout, who had inched closer to Huxley as Miriam spoke. "I understand that," he said. "No," Miriam replied, not unkindly. "You understand the risk. You have not yet understood the cost of removing it." That landed harder than anger would have. Mason had come prepared to be patient. He had not come prepared to be seen. The police academy had not taught him what to do when the person across from him was both vulnerable and correct. The job trained officers to identify hazards, secure scenes, prevent escalation. It did not train them to sit inside a warm room where the danger was real but not immediate, where the person at risk had already built a careful little world around the very thing that might someday hurt her. "Loneliness doesn't make this safe," Mason said. Miriam's fingers tightened once on the notebook. "No, and age does not make me incapable of deciding what happens in my own home." "I didn't say you were incapable. You didn't need to." Huxley lifted his head, not toward Miriam, toward Mason. That small movement stopped him. The old dog did not judge him. Dogs did not carry arguments the way people did, but Huxley knew posture, breath, tension in hands. Mason glanced down and saw that he had wrapped Huxley's leash twice around his palm, pulling the leather tight enough to whiten his knuckles. He loosened it. Miriam noticed. She said nothing. Mason drew in a breath. "Huxley crossed 4 blocks at night because of this. He's 9. His hips are stiff. He should not be doing that. I never called him here." The sentence was quiet, clean, true. For a moment, the room held only the hum of the radiator and Nell's small breath through the toy. Mason could have answered in a dozen ways. He could have explained responsibility, liability, the danger of traffic after dark, how dogs developed habits, how good intentions did not erase foreseeable harm. Every point would have been accurate. Accuracy did not help him. He stood. "I should take him home." Miriam nodded once. Nell stepped after Huxley when he rose. Miriam touched 2 fingers lightly to the puppy's collar, and Nell stopped, though her whole body leaned forward. Scout remained on the rug, ears tilted, watching the old dog cross the room. At the threshold, Huxley paused and looked back. Mason did not call him sharply. He waited. Huxley looked at Scout, then at Nell, then at Miriam's hand resting on the doorframe. Only then did he step onto the porch. The walk home felt longer than 4 blocks. Mason kept Huxley on the leash, close enough that no passing car or slick curb could surprise them. The snow had thinned to scattered crystals, bright under street lamps. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the rails gave off a faint metallic ticking as they cooled after the train. Huxley did not pull. That should have settled the matter. Mason had prevented the unsafe behavior. The loose fence board would be repaired. The dog was safe. The puppies were not in immediate danger. Miriam had clearly refused intervention. There, a clean report could be written out of it, except there was no report, and nothing about it felt clean. At home, Mason led Huxley through the gate, unclipped the leash, and went straight to the pines. He brought out the hammer and 3 long nails from the porch rail. The first nail went through the loose board with a hard crack. The second sank deeper, pulling the wood flush with the frame. The third he drove lower than necessary, as if force could quiet uncertainty. He tested the board from inside the yard. Then from outside it did not move. Huxley watched from the porch, his silver muzzle pale in the light. "Done," Mason said. The word sounded like a verdict. The next evening, the house returned to its old shape. Dinner at 6, medication, dishes washed, blinds half drawn, Huxley by the back door. At 7:20 the freight horn came. Huxley stood. Mason, seated at the kitchen table, did not move. The old dog walked to the door and stopped there, his ears lifted. For several seconds he listened, body angled not toward the yard, but toward the town beyond it. Then his ears lowered. He did not scratch, did not whine, did not even look back. He simply sat down. That obedience unsettled Mason more than the disappearing had. A rule broken could be corrected. A silent request denied had nowhere to go. The doorbell rang at 8:11. Officer Lena Hartwell stood on the porch, holding a folder against her chest and a paper bag from the diner in her other hand. She was shorter than Mason, with a compact, steady build and dark hair cut blunt at her jaw. Snow had collected on the shoulders of her burgundy parka. Her eyes, dark and direct, moved past Mason to Huxley before returning to his face. "You look like you've been arguing with furniture," she said. "I fixed a fence. That explains the expression." Mason stepped aside. Lena came in without ceremony, set the folder on the counter, and placed the diner bag beside it. "Community outreach forms you left in the cruiser. Also fries, because I'm generous and you forget food is not optional. I ate." "When?" Mason did not answer. Lena looked toward Huxley. "He okay?" "Physically, yes, that's a cop answer." Mason opened the bag, more to avoid her eyes than because he wanted fries. Lena waited him out. She had a talent for silence that made people fill it poorly. So Mason told her, "Not everything. Enough. The fence, Harbor Row, Miriam, the puppies, the train, his offer, her refusal." Lena listened from the counter, arms folded, expression unreadable. When he finished, she looked toward Huxley again. "Did you go there as a cop?" "No. Did she feel like you did?" Mason looked at her. "That's not the same question," Lena said. He said nothing. "She neglecting them? No. And safe right now? Not immediately." "Then you can help, Mason. You can advise. You can connect her to rescue, vet care, whatever, but you don't get to walk into a woman's house and turn your experience into a verdict." "That's not what I did." Lena raised one eyebrow. He hated that eyebrow. It had cleared more bad decisions out of rookies than most supervisors' lectures. "You may be right about the risk," she said. "You may be completely right. But if you make her feel like the only way to keep her dignity is to fight you, then you've already made the problem harder." Mason looked down at the black wristwatch on his left arm. The glass had a scratch near the edge, a mark his father had put there years before Mason inherited it. He turned the bezel once. Then again. Lena softened only slightly. "You ever think you like clean answers because messy ones remind you they don't always come in time?" He did not ask what she meant. He knew. After Lena left, Mason sat alone in the kitchen with the fries untouched and the folder still closed. Memory came not as a flash but as a room, a narrow house near the harbor. Steam heat turned too high, a kettle on the stove. A man named Thomas Ivers sitting in a chair beside the window, alive but too weak to reach the phone. Mason had been the officer who insisted the man be removed from the house afterward. The back stairs were unsafe, the wiring questionable, the heat unreliable. Every reason had been sound. Thomas Ivers survived. He also stopped speaking to Mason. At the rehab center, he turned his face to the wall whenever Mason visited. A nurse finally told Mason not to come back unless Thomas asked. He never asked. Mason had told himself the man was angry because losing independence hurt. That was true. But years later, sitting at his own kitchen table while Huxley faced a closed door, Mason wondered if the deeper wound had been simpler. Mason had saved his body without once asking what home meant before taking it away. Huxley remained by the door. The train was long gone, but the dog had not moved to his mat. Mason rose, crossed to the drawer beside the sink, and opened it. Inside lay spare batteries, black tape, a small flashlight, and the leash he had used the night before. He picked it up. Huxley turned his head. "All right," Mason said. His voice was low, rougher than he expected. He took his plain coat from the hook instead of the patrol jacket. No badge showing, no official stance, no answer ready in his pocket. "This time we use the gate," he told Huxley. "And this time I listen first." The old dog came forward so quickly his shoulder brushed the cabinet. His tail struck the lower drawer once, then again, not wildly, just enough to make the room sound alive. Mason clipped the leash to Huxley's collar. Then he opened the door. By morning the snow had turned bright. It lay over Harbor Row in clean sheets, softening the narrow walks and the low roofs, until the little community looked less like a place where rules were posted in office windows, and more like something tucked carefully into the edge of winter. The lake wind had quieted overnight, smoke lifted straight from a few chimneys. A shovel scraped somewhere out of sight, steady and slow. Mason parked his personal truck in the visitor space instead of near the office. He had dressed deliberately, no patrol jacket, no visible badge, no radio clipped to his shoulder, just a navy wool coat, dark jeans, black boots, and Huxley beside him in a fitted winter vest that made the old German shepherd look both dignified and faintly annoyed. "Don't look at me like that," Mason murmured as he clipped the leash. Celia said warmth matters. Huxley gave him one long look, then stepped down from the truck. The walk to Miriam Bellwether's door was short, but Mason felt each step. He had rehearsed an apology twice on the drive over and disliked both versions. They sounded too much like statements, too clean, too easy to place on a table and leave. Before he could knock, Nell barked from inside. Then came the thump of small paws, a scuffle, and Miriam's voice saying, "Not through the door, young lady. We are not fog." The door opened a moment later. Miriam wore her gray cardigan over a pale house dress, but there was a blue scarf wrapped once around her neck, as if she had intended to go outside and changed her mind. Her white hair was pinned low, neater than the night before. She looked at Mason, then at the coat without the badge. "You came as yourself today," she said. "I'm trying to." That was the best apology he had. Miriam held the door wider. Huxley waited at the threshold until she looked down and said, "Come in, old gentleman." Only then did he enter. Nell rushed him with the yellow cloth toy, overran her own paws, and skidded sideways into the rug. Scout stood behind the coffee table, tail low, watching the arrival as though morning had returned in the correct order only after Huxley stepped into the room. Mason stayed near the door. "I owe you an apology," he said. Miriam did not help him. He took that as fair. "I came in here with an answer already made. I saw the walks, the weather, the size they'll be, your knees, the rules I assumed would apply. I treated the future like it had more authority than you did." Miriam's face did not soften all at once. It changed slowly, like snow sliding from a branch. "You were not wrong about the future," she said. "You only asked me to live there before I was finished with today." Mason nodded. The words were gentle, but they did not let him off. He was grateful for that, though it hurt. "I don't want Huxley crossing 4 blocks at night," he said. "I can't allow that, but I also don't want to take something from you, just because it would make me sleep better." Miriam looked toward the rug, where Huxley had lowered himself with a careful bend of the hips. Scout lay down almost immediately, copying him. Nell dropped the toy and pressed her nose beneath Huxley's ear. "Then what are you asking?" Miriam said. "For permission to help without taking over." That finally made her sit. They made the first version of the arrangement at the kitchen table. Beside 2 cups of coffee Mason had not expected to accept, and Miriam had not expected to pour. The coffee was pale enough that Mason could see the bottom of the cup. He drank it anyway. Scout and Nell would remain with Miriam for the time being. Mason would come most mornings before shift to help with short walks and basic training. Huxley would come only through the front gate and always on leash. On days when the lake wind cut hard enough to sting the eyes, Mason would drive Huxley over instead of walking him. On heavy snow days, Huxley would stay home and Mason would come alone. Miriam wrote each point in her blue cloth notebook. "Do you write everything down?" Mason asked. I spent 30 years answering emergency calls, she said. Memory is useful. Paper is kinder. That ended the matter. Later that morning, Mason called Dr. Celia Arroyo from Miriam's kitchen. Celia answered from her clinic between appointments, her voice carrying the calm impatience of someone who had already told many people the truth and expected at least half of them to ignore it. If this is about Huxley pretending he is 5 again, she said, my answer has not changed. Mason looked down at the old dog, who was asleep with Nell's toy against his paw. It's about keeping him useful without being stupid. There was a pause. That, Celia said, is a better question. She agreed to see him that afternoon. At the clinic, a low building with frosted windows and a bell that made Nell bark at her own reflection, Celia examined Huxley with steady hands. She was in teal scrubs under a gray parka, dark hair pulled back, a teal stethoscope looped around her neck like an emblem of practical mercy. Huxley tolerated the exam with wounded dignity. Celia checked his hips, shoulders, paws, teeth, and the way he rose after lying down. She watched him walk across the rubber mat twice. Then she sat back on her heels and scratched lightly beneath his jaw. He can do short visits, she said. He can walk in mild weather. He should wear the vest. He should not be making secret trips across town after dark. He's not, Mason said. Celia looked at him. Not anymore, he corrected. Good. And Mason, he waited. Do not confuse slower with finished. The sentence followed him back to Harbor Row. The work began with almost nothing. Nell had to learn that an open door did not mean she owned the weather. Mason stood inside Miriam's front entry with one hand on the leash and the other holding a small treat. Miriam stood beside him, watching more than helping. Nell launched herself toward the porch. Mason closed the door before she reached it. Nell spun around, offended. Again, Mason said. They did it 17 times before Nell paused long enough to look at him. On the 18th, she sat for half a second. Mason marked the moment with a quiet yes and handed the treat to Miriam. You reward her, he said. This is your door. Miriam's fingers closed around the treat. For some reason, that mattered more than he had expected. Scout's lesson was different. He could leave the house, but only if Nell did not go first. Without his sister's noise to hide inside, he became all eyes and careful feet. He took 3 steps down the salted path, then looked back toward the window where Nell was pressing her paws to the glass. Mason did not pull him forward. He waited. The cold moved around them. A car passed slowly at the entrance to Harbor Row. Somewhere nearby, a garage door shuddered open. Scout's body trembled, not from cold but from decision. Huxley stood at the bottom of the steps, not facing Scout directly, just present. Scout took one more step. Miriam wrote later. Scout reached 4th crack in sidewalk, did not vanish. Important. By the end of the first week, the house had become a place of small victories. Nell sat before the door twice in a row, then celebrated by stealing a dish towel from the oven handle. Scout crossed the porch without dropping flat when a delivery truck rattled past. Huxley lay on the rug during the 7:20 train, his amber eyes half closed, while the puppies discovered that panic lost some of its power when no one else joined it. Mason did not command silence during the train. That had been his first instinct. Stop the barking, correct the reaction, end the disorder. Instead, he learned to wait for the smallest break in fear. A pause between Nell's barks. Scout turning his head away from the window. One paw lowering to the floor. A breath that did not hitch. Miriam rewarded those moments with pieces of kibble from a little jar by her chair. Her timing improved faster than Mason expected. She had a dispatcher's ear for shifts other people missed. One evening, as the train rolled beyond Harbor Row, and Nell stood with her toy clenched in her mouth, Miriam whispered, "There." Her shoulders dropped. Mason had been watching Scout. He looked at Nell and saw she was right. Miriam smiled without looking away from the dogs. "I used to know when a caller had stopped lying about being calm," she said. Same muscle, I suppose. That was the moment Mason understood he was not teaching Miriam how to care. He was giving her different tools for a skill she already had. 2 days later, Tessa Markham arrived, with paperwork held under one arm and snow melting across the shoulders of her cream-colored puffer jacket. She was younger than Mason expected, with tired hazel eyes, a brown-blonde ponytail, and the quick, apologetic energy of someone permanently late to 5 places that all mattered. Nell greeted her by stealing a mitten from her pocket. "Oh," Tessa said, looking at Miriam. "She's learned crime. She had excellent instincts before you came," Miriam replied. Tessa laughed, then nearly cried before she could stop herself. She apologized in the kitchen, standing beside the counter instead of sitting, as if sitting would make the guilt heavier. The rescue had been full. Then the quarantine pens had filled. Then one foster backed out because of a landlord issue. The 72 hours had stretched because everyone kept hoping the next call would solve it. "I should have told you the truth sooner," Tessa said. "Not just a few more days. I should have said I didn't know." Miriam folded her hands around her coffee cup. "Yes," she said. Tessa's eyes lowered. Then Miriam added, "But you brought them somewhere warm. That counts too. It doesn't fix the burden." "No," Miriam said, "but not everything that becomes heavy started as carelessness." Tessa sat after that. Mason watched from the doorway, Huxley leaning lightly against his leg. There was a kind of grace in seeing two people refuse to turn guilt into blame. It made him uncomfortable in the way useful things often did. Over the next several days, Mason's help spread beyond the dogs, though he tried not to make a performance of it. He replaced the weak bulb above Miriam's porch because the yellow light flickered whenever the wind pushed at the wiring. He added a rubber-backed mat inside the door after Scout slid twice. He carried a heavy bag of puppy food from his truck to the pantry and put it exactly where Miriam pointed, not where he thought it belonged. That was harder than it sounded. Miriam noticed. "You are learning restraint," she said one morning. "I've been accused of worse. I am sure Officer Hartwell has a list." "She does." Miriam's coffee remained weak. Mason continued drinking it. After the third cup over 3 different mornings, she set the pot down and said, "You know you can ask me to make it stronger. I know, but you won't." "No, Mom, why?" Mason looked at the cup. "Because you make it before I get here." Miriam did not answer right away. Then she poured herself half a cup and sat across from him. Their conversations grew in pieces, not confessions. Miriam told him about the old call center, back when dispatchers used paper maps and knew which rural roads washed out first. Mason told her about Marquette in lake-effect snow, how crashes happened in clusters because one mistake became a warning too late for the next driver. She did not ask why he checked the lock every time he entered. He did not ask why she sometimes set 2 cups on the table before remembering and returning one to the cabinet. The untouched questions became part of the room, not hidden exactly, just respected. One afternoon near the end of the second week, the clouds broke open over Harbor Row and sunlight filled the living room so brightly that the snow outside seemed to glow from within. Scout and Nell had worn themselves out with separate leash sessions and a brief, ridiculous argument over a cardboard tube. Both now slept near Huxley, one curled against his back, the other sprawled with all 4 paws in the air. Miriam sat with the blue notebook open on her lap. Mason stood by the front door, hand on the knob he had tightened that morning. The house looked different from the first night. Not cleaner. It had already been clean. Not safer. Exactly, though the new mat helped and the bulb no longer flickered. It looked inhabited by purpose. Miriam wrote slowly, the pen moving across the page. Mason saw the line before she closed the notebook. Today Huxley did not visit the puppies. Huxley brought Mason with him, and Mason stayed long enough to become useful. He looked away before she could see he had read it. Outside, the late sun struck the snow along the shared walk. Inside, Scout sighed in his sleep. Nell twitched one paw against Huxley's side. The old German shepherd did not move away. Mason had thought he was helping manage 2 dogs until a better solution could be found. Standing there in the quiet warmth of Miriam's little house, he understood he had stepped into something more delicate than a problem. He had stepped into the rhythm she had been using all her strength to keep. The peace did not break all at once. For several days, It simply changed its weight. Mason noticed it first in Miriam's kitchen, though he did not know what he was noticing. The blue notebook stayed open on the table, but Miriam wrote less. Her coffee sat longer in the pot. When Nell stole the dish towel from the oven handle, Miriam still said the puppy's name with the same dry patience, but she reached for the towel a little more slowly. Scout seemed to feel it too. He had grown taller in the past week, his paws less ridiculous beneath him, his cautious eyes now level with the edge of the coffee table. He watched Miriam more often, as though something in her quiet had shifted out of place. Nell, being Nell, responded to tension by stealing things. That Thursday afternoon, Mason arrived after a late shift with Huxley beside him, the old dog wearing his navy winter vest against the cold. Harbor Row looked bright under a thin layer of thawing snow. Water dripped steadily from the eaves. The shared walk had turned dark with slush where the morning sun touched it, but the grass beyond remained hard and white in the shade. Miriam opened the door before he knocked. "Careful on the mat," she said. "Nell believes it belongs farther from the door." Mason looked down. The rubber-backed mat he had placed there last week had indeed been dragged several inches toward the living room, its corner curled like a tongue. "Nell," he said. From inside came a muffled sound of pride. Huxley entered first. Scout met him at the rug with a restrained wag, while Nell appeared from behind Miriam's chair, carrying something pale and folded in her mouth. At first Mason thought it was a napkin. Then he saw the letterhead. Miriam moved too quickly for someone trying to seem unconcerned. "Nell, drop." The puppy bolted. She ran around the coffee table, tail high, the folded paper flapping from her mouth like a captured flag. Scout barked once because running seemed to require comment. Huxley watched from the rug with the grave disappointment of an old officer witnessing poor procedure. Mason crouched, took a piece of kibble from the jar near the chair, and held it out without chasing. Nell. The puppy skidded, considered the economy of paper versus food, and made the sensible choice. Mason caught the page before it hit the floor. Miriam's hand closed around the edge of the kitchen counter. The paper had been folded once, then opened, then folded again badly. Across the top, printed in dark blue, were the words Harbor Row Residential Association. Mason did not read further yet. He looked at Miriam. "How long?" 2 days. His jaw tightened before he could stop it. "Miriam, I was going to tell you when I had something useful to say. That is not the same as telling me." "No," she said, "it is not." The room lost its ordinary warmth. Nell chewed her kibble. Unaware that she had opened a door no one had been ready to touch. Scout pressed closer to Huxley. Outside, water fell from the gutter in steady ticks. Mason unfolded the notice. The language was polite. That made it worse. Polite words had a way of carrying decisions without admitting they were heavy. Unregistered animals. 2 dogs over the permitted number for a single residence. Repeated barking after evening quiet hours. Damage to shared lawn area. A cushion removed from a porch chair and found along the walkway. Concerns regarding resident safety once the animals matured in size and strength. Response requested within 10 days. 10 days. Mason read the final line twice. "I'm going to the office," he said. "No, Miriam, no," she repeated. "You are not going there angry. They put this under your door. They are allowed to put notices under doors. That is one of the less violent things paper can do. They could have spoken to you. They have spoken to me. This is written plainly. That isn't the same." Miriam stepped away from the counter. Her face had gone pale in the way controlled people sometimes looked when they refused to tremble. "The man in number 7 works nights," she said. "Ray Calder. He leaves at 10:30 and sleeps after supper. Nell has woken him more than once. Scout joins if she starts. Mr. Calder has not been cruel about it," he complained. "He is tired." Mason looked back at the notice. And the lawn? The groundskeeper filled the same little trench twice. Nell digs when the snow softens. Scout helps by looking guilty beside her. Despite himself, Mason almost smiled. It disappeared quickly. The cushion? Nell carried it from Mrs. Albrecht's porch to the middle walk. Mrs. Albrecht uses a cane. She laughed when it happened. Then she nearly stepped around it and lost her balance. Miriam folded her arms, not defensively, but to hold herself together. These facts do not become false because I dislike the conclusion. Mason felt anger searching for a target and finding only reasonable people. He hated that. A careless villain would have been easier. Someone rude, someone smug, someone who saw Miriam as a nuisance instead of a neighbor. Mason knew how to stand between that kind of person and someone who needed room to breathe, but Ray Calder needed sleep. Mrs. Albrecht needed a clear walkway. Harbor Row needed rules because ICE did not care about affection. Owen Kincaid, whose name was signed at the bottom, had a responsibility that did not vanish because Miriam's house had finally begun to sound alive. Mason folded the paper more sharply than he intended. "You should have told me." "I know. Why didn't you?" Miriam looked toward Scout and Nell. Both puppies were now at Huxley's side. Nell's stolen triumph had been forgotten. Scout rested his chin near the old dog's paw, watching the people. "Because I knew what would happen," Miriam said. "You would start solving. Forms, offices, phone calls, arguments. You would do it kindly, perhaps. But the house would change before anything had actually been taken from it." Mason did not answer. "I wanted 2 more mornings," she said. "That is all. 2 mornings where I opened the bedroom door, and they were waiting there before the paper entered the room." Her voice did not break. That made it harder to hear. Mason lowered the notice to the table. The anger had not gone away, but it had lost its direction. Miriam had not hidden the paper because she was irresponsible. She had hidden it because the life they were building had become fragile enough that even a deadline felt like a hand closing around it. Still, hiding it did not stop the clock. 2 evenings later, they attended the Harbor Row meeting. The community room sat beside the small office near the entrance, a low-ceilinged space with beige walls, a coffee urn, folding chairs, and a bulletin board full of snow removal reminders and outdated flyers. The room smelled faintly of floor cleaner and old paper. Outside the window, the shared lawn lay under a crust of frozen snow, with porch lights glowing at equal intervals along the row of homes. Miriam sat beside Mason, the blue notebook closed on her lap. Huxley was not with them. Mason had left him home after Dr. Arroyo recommended fewer evening outings in icy weather. That absence made Mason feel oddly exposed. Without the dog at his feet, there was nothing between his first instinct and the people across the table. Owen Kincaid began the meeting exactly on time. He was tall and narrow, with neatly combed gray hair, wire-frame glasses, and a brown leather folder worn soft at the corners. He did not have the face of a man who enjoyed confrontation. If anything, he looked like someone who wished every problem could be solved by following the document already in front of him. "Miriam," Owen said, "thank you for coming." "Of course." His eyes moved to Mason. "Sergeant Wycliffe." "Mr. Kincaid, I understand you are here as support, not in an official police capacity." "I am." Owen nodded once, apparently satisfied by the distinction. Ray Calder sat 2 chairs down from him, broad-shouldered and tired-looking in a brown work jacket that had seen more salt than care. His gray hair was cut short, and dark shadows sat beneath pale blue eyes. A steel thermos rested on the floor near his boot. He kept both hands folded and looked at the table instead of at Miriam. Owen opened the folder. "The issue is not whether the animals are loved," he said. "I want that clear first. No one here is suggesting neglect." Miriam's fingers tightened on the notebook. "The issue," Owen continued, "is whether Harbor Row can safely accommodate 2 unregistered German Shepherd puppies in a unit without a private yard, especially as they grow." Mason kept his mouth closed. That required effort. Owen reviewed the rule. 1 registered dog per residence, size not exceeding what the resident could safely control. No persistent noise after evening quiet hours. No obstruction of shared walkways. He did not dramatize the violations. He did not soften them either. Then Ray cleared his throat. "I should say my part," he said. His voice was rough, not hostile. A man who had swallowed too much coffee and too little rest. Miriam turned toward him. Ray did not quite meet her eyes. "I don't hate dogs," he said. "Had a mutt named Captain when I was a kid, dumb as a sack of bolts. Loved him." A few people smiled faintly. Ray did not. I work nights at the harbor maintenance shop. I sleep when most folks are watching television. The barking usually starts after that train. Sometimes it stops quick, sometimes it doesn't. I know they're puppies. I know they're learning. He rubbed one hand over his jaw. I also know I've gone into a shift twice this week with maybe 3 hours sleep. Miriam closed her eyes for a second. Ray looked at her then. I heard you laugh last week, he said quietly, when the little one dragged that towel clean across your porch. I was coming back from the mailbox. First time I'd heard that sound from your place in a long while. Miriam opened her eyes. I was glad, Ray said. I mean that, but being glad for you doesn't make me less tired. The room changed, not dramatically. No one moved. No one spoke. But Mason felt the argument he had prepared begin to lose shape in his hands. It was one thing to defend Miriam from rules on paper. It was another to sit across from a man who had noticed her laughter and still needed sleep. Mason had wanted a fight because fights came with sides. This did not. Owen turned to him. Sergeant, I understand you have been assisting with training. Mason placed both hands flat on the table. Yes, I help with morning walks. We're working on door manners, separate leash time, settling during the train. We appreciate that. The improvement has been noticed. That surprised him. Owen continued, but I have to ask what the plan is beyond your goodwill. What happens when your shift changes? If weather prevents you from coming, if Huxley cannot accompany them, if one of these dogs reaches 70 pounds and lunges on ice. Mason had answers to each single question, not to all of them together. I can keep helping, he said. For how long? The words were not sharp, but they landed with precision. Mason looked at Miriam. She was staring down at the notebook, thumb resting against the edge of the cover. She did not rescue him from the silence. Goodwill, experience, discipline, affection, none of them were a structure. Owen folded his hands. We are not making a final decision tonight. The association will allow a short response period, as the notice states, but we need something more formal than informal assistance. Mason nodded once. The meeting ended without raised voices. That made the outcome feel more serious. Outside, Miriam paused under the small awning near the community room door. The air had sharpened after sunset. Snow crunched beneath Mason's boots as he walked beside her toward her unit. I wanted them to be wrong, he said. Miriam looked ahead. So did I. They weren't. No. He glanced down at her. I'm still angry. At whom? That stopped him. Miriam's mouth curved faintly, but there was no humor in it. Be careful, she said. Anger with no proper address will knock on the nearest door. At her porch, she unlocked the door. Scout and Nell erupted inside. Paws sliding, voices bright, unaware of meetings, rules, or 10-day deadlines. The sound filled the little house with such immediate joy that Mason felt the unfairness of the situation like cold water. Miriam stepped inside, and both puppies pressed against her legs. She did not bend right away. She only stood there, letting them crowd her, letting the room recognize her return. Mason did not enter, not that night. He said goodnight and walked back to his truck alone. At home, Huxley met him at the door with his old calm, sniffed his coat, then lowered his head as if he smelled the meeting on him. Mason removed his boots, washed his hands, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the overhead light. For a long time he did nothing. Then he opened his laptop. The email was still there, buried beneath notices, department scheduling, and promotional updates he had never unsubscribed from because unsubscribing felt too much like admitting he still cared. Great Lakes Working Dog Transition and Rescue Network. The subject line read, Checking in, Huxley and possible support role. Mason had avoided the organization for nearly 2 years. After Huxley's last official evaluation, they had asked whether Mason would help with retired K9 placements and difficult shepherd transitions. Then a fundraising draft had crossed his inbox with language about hero handlers, second chances, and healing through service. Someone had meant well. Mason had felt turned into a photograph before he had agreed to stand still. He had stopped answering. Now he read the last email again. Huxley lay beneath the table, his body warm against Mason's boot. This isn't about us, Mason said. The dog shifted once. Mason clicked the phone number in the signature. A woman answered on the fourth ring, voice alert but tired. Great Lakes Transition and Rescue, this is Dana. My name is Mason Wycliffe, he said. I used to work with Officer Graham after Huxley retired. A pause. Sergeant Wycliffe, yes, I remember. I'm calling about 2 German Shepherd puppies, not canines, civilian surrender. Currently with an elderly resident as an informal foster. They're cared for, but the housing situation isn't built for them long term. We need an assessment and a temporary plan before the community forces a rushed separation. Another pause, shorter this time. Are you calling in an official capacity? No, Mason said. I'm calling as a handler with experience, a neighbor trying not to make a bad situation worse, and the person who should have asked for help before tonight. Dana's voice softened by half a degree. Are the dogs in danger? Not tonight. Is the resident willing to speak with us? I'll ask her, not order her. Ask. Good, Dana said. Then we can start there. Mason closed his eyes. Dana took down the details. Scout and Nell, approximate age. Tessa Markham's involvement, Harbor Rose deadline, Miriam's name, Dr. Arroyo's clinic, Mason's contact information. She said an evaluator could come early the following week if Miriam agreed. When the call ended, the kitchen seemed quieter, but not empty. Mason set the phone face down on the table. Huxley raised his head, amber eyes catching the small light from the laptop screen. I know, Mason said softly. Took me long enough. Huxley settled again. For the first time since finding the notice in Nell's mouth, Mason did not feel the urge to storm into an office, argue a policy, or carry the whole problem on his own back. He had not solved anything, but he had opened the right door. Dana Pierce arrived with a clipboard, a soft voice, and the careful eyes of someone who had learned not to judge a home from the doorway. She worked for Great Lakes Working Dog Transition and Rescue Network, though she did not wear anything that announced it beyond a small patch sewn onto the sleeve of her dark winter coat. She was in her early 50s, with silver threaded through short brown hair and a way of entering a room that made nervous animals look twice but not run. When Miriam opened the door, Dana did not look first at the puppies. She looked at Miriam. Mrs. Bellwether, she said, offering one gloved hand. Thank you for agreeing to let me come. Miriam shook it. I agreed to a conversation, not a verdict. Dana nodded. That is exactly the right place to start. Mason stood beside the porch steps with Huxley on a leash, feeling strangely unnecessary. Tessa Markham hovered near the walkway with a canvas folder pressed against her chest, her cream-colored puffer jacket bright against the gray morning. Guilt still clung to her in small movements. The way she tucked her hands into her sleeves, the way she looked at Miriam before speaking, the way she checked the rescue paperwork twice. Though nothing had changed since the parking lot. Dr. Celia Arroyo arrived 10 minutes later from the clinic, carrying a black medical bag and a travel scale. She had traded her teal scrubs for a navy field coat, but the same calm authority came with her. She greeted Huxley first, pressing 2 fingers gently to the old dog's shoulder before saying hello to Mason. Still wearing the vest, she said. Against his will, Mason replied. Most good medicine is inside. Nell greeted everyone by attempting to remove a pen from Dana's clipboard. Scout retreated behind Huxley, and then, after a moment, stepped out again, as if embarrassed by his own caution. The assessment was not what Mason had feared. No one stood in the middle of Miriam's living room, announcing failures. Dana asked questions while seated, not towering. Celia weighed the puppies on a towel spread across the kitchen floor. Tessa filled in the surrender history where she could, speaking carefully when she did not know an answer. Miriam's blue notebook sat open on the table. Dana read through it slowly. Feeding times, sleeping habits, train response, separate leash temps, stool notes, weight estimates, door manners, little victories recorded with the dignity of weather reports. You've done exceptional work, Dana said. Miriam looked down at her hands. They are not difficult to love. That is not the same as easy to raise. No, Miriam said, it is not. Celia finished examining Scout, who endured the process solemnly, then Nell, who considered the stethoscope a possible toy until Huxley exhaled from the rug and she reconsidered. The puppies were healthy, growing, bright-eyed. Under-socialized in some ways, over-attached in others, but not damaged. "They're lucky," Celia said. Mason watched Miriam's face when she heard it. The relief there was quiet and almost painful. Not pride, exactly. More like someone who had carried a bowl full to the brim and learned she had not spilled as much as she feared. Then Celia added the rest. "They are also going to need more than luck soon." No one moved. Celia sat back on her heels, speaking to Miriam, not around her. "Scout will need confidence away from Nell. Nell will need impulse control before her body catches up with her enthusiasm. Both will need longer walks, separate training, a safe place to run, and someone with enough strength to manage sudden pulling on ice. You are doing well today, I believe that, but they are growing toward a life this unit may not be able to hold." Miriam looked toward the window. Outside, the shared lawn lay beneath a thin white crust of snow, clean and narrow and public. No fence, no private run, no place where two young German shepherds could stretch into the dogs they were becoming without crossing someone else's space. Dana did not press. That was to her credit. Instead, she explained the options. A temporary foster extension through the rescue network, written support from Mason, training logs, veterinary records, formal registration while the long-term plan was considered. Not a rescue removal, not surrender, not yet. Miriam listened to every word. At the Harbor Row office that afternoon, Owen Kincaid reviewed the proposal with his brown leather folder open in front of him. Ray Calder sat against the wall with his steel thermos between his boots, present because the barking affected him, not because he wanted to be part of anyone's private sorrow. Owen's approval was precise and limited, 30 days. Scout and Nell would be registered temporarily through the rescue network. Mason would sign as daily support for walking and transport when needed. The puppies would not use the shared lawn without an adult capable of controlling them. Noise after evening quiet hours would be documented, not ignored. Any serious safety incident could end the extension early. Miriam accepted the terms without argument. Mason signed where Dana indicated. The pen felt heavier than it should have. On paper, it looked like a victory. Miriam had more time. The puppies stayed. Harbor Row had not forced an immediate separation. Owen had not hardened into a villain. Ray had not demanded removal. Tessa looked as if she might finally sleep. Yet when Mason walked Miriam back to her unit, he noticed that she did not smile. 30 days, he said. Yes, that gives us room. Miriam paused at her porch and looked at the 2 narrow tracks of paw prints leading to her door. No, she said softly, it gives us time. Room is something else. The difference stayed with him. Over the next weeks, the time did what time always did. It moved forward without asking whether anyone was ready. Scout and Nell grew. Not dramatically from one day to the next. There was no single morning when Mason arrived and found 2 adult dogs where puppies had slept. But the changes gathered in inches and pounds. Scout's legs lengthened until the dipped ear no longer made him look quite so small. Nell's chest broadened. The harness that had once hung loose across her shoulders needed to be adjusted to the next notch, then the next. Miriam marked it in the notebook. Nell, harness let out again. Scout reached window latch with nose. Both, no longer fit together under kitchen chair, did not approve. Mason laughed when he read the last line. Miriam did not. The bags of food became heavier. The water bowl emptied faster. The towel bed beside the radiator had to be unfolded into 2 layers because both puppies could no longer curl into the same hollow without one of them waking offended. Scout needed longer walks to settle. Nell could pull a leash tight if a gull lifted from the frozen edge of the lawn. Mason helped as promised. He came before shift when he could. On days when his schedule changed, he came after. He drove them to Dr. Arroyo's clinic for boosters, 1 crate in the back, Huxley resting on the floor of the truck, Miriam in the passenger seat holding the blue notebook like a map. At the clinic, Miriam managed the paperwork better than anyone. She remembered dates. She knew which treats Nell ignored and which ones Scout accepted only if the room was quiet. But when it came time to move both puppies from the truck to the door, Mason had to take one leash, and Tessa, who happened to be there with another rescue dog, took the other. Miriam stood with the clipboard pressed to her chest. No one said anything. That was worse. One Sunday afternoon, Mason brought Miriam to his house so the puppies could run in his fenced yard under supervision. He had shoveled a path from the back door and cleared the gate. Huxley settled beneath the bare maple, vest on, paws tucked under him like a retired supervisor inspecting recruits. Scout hesitated at first, uncertain what to do with so much space that did not require permission from every porch and window. Nell understood immediately. She launched herself across the snow, turned too sharply, tumbled, sprang up, and ran again. Scout watched her, watched Huxley, then followed with a low burst of joy that startled Mason with its force. The two young shepherds chased each other around the maple, through the soft drifts near the fence, back toward Miriam, then away again as if discovering that the world could be wide and still safe. Miriam stood on the porch. Her gloved hands rested on the railing. Her blue scarf lifted slightly in the wind. For the first time since the notice, Mason saw the whole truth arrive in her face, not as surrender, as recognition. The yard did not love Scout and Nell more than she did. It simply gave their bodies an answer her living room could not. Nell came charging toward the porch, and stopped only because Mason stepped into her path with a practiced hand signal. Scout circled back to Huxley and dropped beside him, panting, bright-eyed, snow clinging to his whiskers. Miriam looked at the fence, the gate, the space beneath the maple, and then down at her own narrow porch boots. When she spoke, her voice was nearly lost in the wind. They look like themselves here. Mason heard her. He did not answer. The 30 days continued. Miriam never complained. That was part of the problem. She adapted with the discipline of a woman who had spent her life answering other people's emergencies calmly. She spread meals farther apart. She practiced door manners. She used the shallow tray for Nell. She kept Scout's lamp on during the train. She accepted help carrying food bags and pretended not to notice when Mason slowed his pace to match hers on icy walks. But the question had already entered the room. It did not leave. On a morning after heavy snow, Mason was called before sunrise to a multi-car slide near the lake road. His voice came through Miriam's phone with the hollow rush of wind and traffic behind it. "I'm not going to make the morning walk," he said. "I can come by after 9. We will manage one morning. Take them one at a time. I know." "Miriam, I know," she repeated and ended the call before his concern could grow into instructions. By 7, the puppies had eaten. The snow outside was clean, bright, and deceptive. The shared walk had been shoveled, but a thin glaze of ice remained where meltwater had refrozen near the edge. Miriam clipped Scout's leash first, then Nell's. She had watched Mason do this enough times to understand the choreography. Keep the leashes short but not tense. Reward attention before excitement took over. Move before the puppies had time to invent their own direction. Do not let Nell build speed. Do not let Scout retreat behind her. Understanding the steps did not make her body younger. Nell saw a sparrow near the low shrubs and lunged. Scout heard a truck door slam 2 units away and turned back toward the house. Miriam brought both leashes close to her waist, planted her boots, and held. No one fell. No leash slipped. Nothing dramatic happened. That was what made the truth so clean. For nearly 10 minutes, she tried again and again. 3 steps forward. Stop. 1 puppy ahead. 1 behind. Nell quivering toward the birds. Scout staring toward the porch as if Huxley might appear and explain the morning. Miriam's breath grew visible and uneven in the cold. They reached only halfway across the shared lawn. The puppies were not bad. Miriam was not failing. The morning was not cruel. It was simply honest. She turned them back. Inside, the house welcomed them with warmth and the smell of coffee she had not poured. Nell bounced twice, frustrated by the unfinished outing, then grabbed the red leash from the table and brought it to Miriam's slipper as if asking to begin again properly. Scout went to the window and stood with his nose near the glass, looking down the path Mason usually walked. Miriam removed her gloves slowly. She placed both leashes on the kitchen table. Then she sat. When Mason arrived a little after 9, the coffee was made but untouched. Huxley came in first, shook snow from his vest, and went straight to Scout, who leaned briefly into the old dog's shoulder. Nell brought the leash to Mason, then to Miriam, then back to Mason. Unable to understand why the morning had not become what it usually was, Mason took off his coat. "How did it go?" he asked. Miriam looked toward the window. Sunlight had begun to soften the snow on the lawn, leaving a narrow white border in the shade. "I got them outside," she said. Mason waited. "I did not give them what the walk was supposed to give them." He sat across from her without removing the leashes from the table. Miriam folded her hands once, then unfolded them. "I can give them warmth," she said. "I can give them breakfast at the same time every morning. I can notice when Scout's ears change before the train. I can hear Nell planning mischief from another room. I can make certain they never believe they are unwanted." Her voice stayed steady. That was its own kind of bravery. "But I cannot give them the whole life they are growing into." Mason's throat tightened. He did not say he had known. He did not say it was for the best. He did not reach across the table too quickly or begin arranging logistics like a shield against grief. He waited. Miriam looked at him then, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed tired not from age, but from loving something enough to see beyond herself. "I want them with you," she said. "Both of them." Mason's hand closed once around the edge of the chair. "They stay together," she said. "Yes, they still hear my voice. Yes, they still know this house. Yes, and I am not to become a story you tell about the woman who could not keep them." Mason shook his head. No, Nell had gone quiet. She stood near the hallway, head tilted, as if some part of the room had shifted in a language even puppies understood. Then she disappeared down the short hall and came back carrying an old slipper in her mouth. Mason had seen it before near Scout's bed. Worn brown leather collapsed at the heel, soft with age. Miriam's husband's slipper. Scout often slept with his chin across it, guarding a scent that belonged to a life he had never known. Nell carried it to Miriam and laid it against her foot. Scout came from the window and placed his chin on top of it. For several seconds Miriam did not move. Then she bent slowly, lifted the slipper with both hands, and held it against the blue scarf at her chest. "He won't mind," she whispered. She stood, walked to the small box Tessa had left for rescue supplies, and placed the slipper inside, not as surrender, as provision. The room remained warm. The puppies were still there. Huxley lay on the rug with his head up, watching all of them. Nothing had been taken yet. But the decision had entered the house, and this time Miriam was the one who opened the door. The day Scout and Nell moved into Mason's house did not look like a farewell. No neighbors gathered on the shared walk. No one stood behind curtains with the solemn curiosity people sometimes mistake for concern. No speeches were made in the Harbor Row community room. There were no photographs, no ceremonial handoff, no rescue volunteer saying something soft enough to make everyone feel better. There was only Miriam Bellwether at her kitchen table, folding a blue wool blanket into a careful square. She did it slowly, smoothing each corner with the flat of her hand. Scout sat beside her chair with his chin resting on the old slipper that had belonged to her husband. Nell kept stealing small items from the open box, not to run away with them, only to carry them 3 feet and bring them back as if inventory required movement. Mason stood near the doorway and let the room take its time. That had become his part in things now, not stepping forward too fast. The cardboard box on the table held the pieces of the life Miriam had built for the puppies. The yellow cloth toy Nell always brought to Huxley, Scout's small navy leash, Nell's red one, the shallow tray that had slowed her meals. The first collar Scout had outgrown, and the blue notebook with its cloth cover softened by Miriam's hands. She placed the notebook on top of the blanket. Mason looked away for a moment. Some objects were too intimate to watch being packed. Tessa Markham arrived with the final paperwork under one arm and a travel bag of supplies in the other. Her brown-blonde ponytail was tucked beneath a knit cap, and snowmelt darkened the shoulders of her cream puffer jacket. She did not speak loudly when she entered. Even Nell seemed to understand that this was not a morning for chaos, though she still nosed hopefully at the zipper of the supply bag. "All right," Tessa said softly. Dana signed off. "Temporary foster-to-adopt placement with Mason, continued visitation, and training participation for you, Miriam. Rescue remains available for follow-up." Miriam nodded. "That sounds very official." "It is." Tessa's mouth trembled into a small smile. "I thought official might help today." "Today," Miriam said, "I will allow it." Dr. Celia Arroyo came next, not to examine the puppies in any dramatic sense, but to do what practical people did when emotion was too large for the room. She checked Scout's paws, Nell's harness fit, Huxley's gait, the vaccination folder, and Mason's proposed feeding schedule. Her dark hair was pinned back beneath a gray winter hat, and her teal stethoscope disappeared into the front pocket of her coat. "Separate walks," Celia reminded Mason. "Together sometimes, separately on purpose. Scout needs confidence without Nell. Nell needs impulse control without Scout turning every moment into a committee meeting." Mason accepted the folder, understood. Celia gave him a look. "I know you understand. I'm checking whether you'll remember when they make it difficult." "I'll remember." Miriam, still seated at the table, said, "I'll write it down in case he becomes unreliable." That made Celia smile. Outside, a truck door closed. Officer Lena Hartwell came in without uniform, wearing a dark hoodie under a navy puffer jacket, work gloves tucked into one pocket. She had not come as a police officer. She had come because 2 heavy bags of puppy food waited by the pantry, and because she knew Mason well enough to understand that he would try to carry everything alone if no one made it inconvenient. She lifted one bag, tested the weight, and looked at him. "You sure you want 2 growing shepherds in your house?" "No." "Good. Honest answers are healthier." Mason took the second bag. As they carried the food toward the truck, Lena paused beside him on the porch. Her dark hair moved in the cold wind, and her eyes shifted toward the warm window where Miriam stood with the puppies pressing at her legs. "You made room for the dogs," Lena said. "Now make sure you don't shrink her place in their lives." "I won't. She needs more than permission to visit. Permission can still feel like waiting outside someone else's door." Mason looked toward the truck bed, then back at the house. Lena's voice softened just enough to keep the words from cutting. "Don't turn a promise into another cage." He carried that sentence inside with the last bag. At Mason's house, Scout entered like a guest who suspected every room might have rules he had not been taught yet. He followed Huxley from the mudroom into the kitchen, then to the living room, stopping at each threshold until the old German shepherd crossed first. Only then did Scout step over, ears shifting, eyes wide. Nell required no such permission. She raced through the kitchen, found a towel hanging from the oven handle, pulled it down, and dragged it proudly to Huxley. The old dog looked at the towel, then at Mason, as if asking whether this was the standard of recruit being accepted into the household. "She came with references," Mason said. Huxley exhaled and lay down. Mason had prepared 2 new dog beds beside Huxley's mat. He had moved a small table from the mudroom to make space, raised the food bins onto a shelf, checked the gate latch twice, and placed a second water bowl near the back door. Everything looked organized. Everything looked ready. By bedtime, both new beds remained empty. Scout and Nell slept pressed against Huxley's back, one on each side, their paws overlapping in a tangle of trust. Huxley opened one amber eye when Nell's hind leg slid across his ribs, then closed it again with the patience of an old officer accepting that new recruits often misunderstood personal space. Mason stood in the doorway longer than necessary. The house was no longer quiet in the same way. A water bowl clicked against the floor. Nell huffed in her sleep. Scout made a small sound and settled when Huxley's tail shifted against him. The sounds were ordinary, but they changed the shape of the room. For years, order had made silence easier. Now, order would have to learn to share space with life. Miriam came the next afternoon. She did not ring the bell. Mason had told her to knock once and come in, but she knocked twice anyway. When the door opened, Scout reached her first, body low with relief. Nell came next, carrying the yellow toy as if Miriam had traveled across the world and required proof that nothing important had been lost. Huxley followed last. Miriam did not cry. She knelt slowly, one hand braced on the doorframe, and let both puppies crowd against her coat. Mason stood back. Her blue notebook was tucked under one arm. That became the new rhythm. Miriam visited most afternoons. At first, Mason worried the arrivals and departures would make the puppies frantic, but Celia was right. Predictability softened separation. Miriam trained with them under the bare maple when the weather allowed. Scout learned to come to her voice even when Mason stood farther away. Nell learned that sitting before Miriam counted just as much as sitting before Mason. Sometimes, Miriam read on the porch while the 3 dogs scattered around her chair. Huxley lay closest to the steps, where he could see the yard and the gate. Scout often chose the space by Miriam's boots. Nell moved from patch of sunlight to patch of sunlight, carrying the yellow toy as if the afternoon might need decorating. The rescue network found a place for Miriam, too. Dana called one morning and asked if she would consider helping with follow-up calls from home. Not emergency calls, not crisis dispatch, just check-ins with people fostering older dogs, anxious shepherds, or animals recently moved from one home to another. Miriam was quiet for so long that Dana asked if the line had failed. "No," Miriam said. "I was deciding whether I am insulted or useful." "And useful," Miriam answered, "but only if you send forms with enough space for proper notes." Within a week, a stack of folders sat on her kitchen table. Miriam made calls in the morning, her blue notebook open beside the rescue forms. She knew how to hear what people did not say. A pause before, "Fine." A laugh too quick after "he's settling." A tired voice pretending not to be tired. She did not fix every problem. She made sure fewer of them went unnamed. Ray Calder left the first bag of dog treats outside Miriam's door in early February. No note at first. Just a small paper sack with a receipt still inside. Miriam found it after lunch and suspected 3 people before she saw Ray crossing the shared walk with his steel thermos in one hand. "You left something," she called. He stopped without turning fully around. "Store had a discount. I no longer have dogs living here. Dogs visit, that they do." Ray nodded once and continued toward his unit. After that, he greeted Huxley by name when Mason passed with the 3 dogs. He never became sentimental about it. He did not need to. The nod was enough. Owen Kincaid did not change Harbor Row's pet rule. He did, however, write a letter for the rescue file stating that Miriam had acted responsibly, cooperated fully, and maintained a relationship with the dogs after placement. In Owen's language, it was almost affectionate. Mason returned to work with Great Lakes too, but under conditions he made plain before agreeing. No photographs of Huxley in promotional material. No story about Miriam without her written consent. No turning grief, age, or loneliness into a fundraising hook. Dana agreed so quickly he wondered if she had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. 3 months after the move, snow fell over Marquette in quiet. Wet flakes that brightened the streets without burying them. It was the kind of evening when porch lights turned the air gold and the lake wind kept its distance. At 7:20, the freight horn moved across the rooftops. Scout barked once, then looked at Huxley. Nell ran to the hooks where the leashes hung, leapt once, missed, and sat as if sitting had been the plan all along. Huxley stood at the front door. The old dog turned his silvered muzzle toward Mason. There was no loose board behind the pines now, no secret passage, no 4-block crossing made by an aging dog alone in the dark. Mason knew the temperature, the sidewalk condition, and Huxley's limits. The snow was light, the wind was mild, the vest hung by the door. He clipped 3 leashes. Scout waited while Nell trembled with excitement. Huxley stood between them, calm as an old habit, transformed into something gentler. They walked to Harbor Row under streetlights softened by falling snow. Not quickly, not ceremonially, just together. Miriam was waiting beneath her porch light with a small tin beside her chair. She always prepared 3 biscuits for the dogs, and a 4th she claimed was accidental. That evening, as usual, she broke the 4th in half and looked offended when Mason noticed. "You count too closely," she said. "Occupational flaw. Work on it." Scout settled near her boots, chin resting on the old slipper she now kept by the porch chair for visits. Nell placed the yellow cloth toy beside Huxley and pressed her shoulder against his neck. Huxley lay across the walkway, not blocking it, but positioned where he could see both Miriam's door and the road back to Mason's house. Mason sat in the wooden chair he had repaired months earlier. The train cars rolled beyond the dark houses, their sound fading into the lake wind. Miriam handed him a cup of coffee from a thermos. It was stronger now. He took a sip and looked at her. She pretended not to see. For a while, no one said anything that needed answering. Snow collected on the railing. Ray Calder's porch light came on next door. Somewhere inside Harbor Row, a television murmured behind a closed window. The world had not become less lonely. No story could honestly promise that. But this corner of it had become less empty. Mason looked at Huxley and understood, finally, that the old dog had never been trying to solve the future. Huxley had simply refused to let need remain unseen. He had crossed the winter streets until Mason learned to walk them properly. With a leash, with limits, with humility, and with enough patience to sit before deciding what help should look like. Some families lived under one roof. Others learned the hour to arrive. The 7:20 train no longer called Huxley away. It reminded all of them when to come together. Sometimes love does not mean holding on tighter. Sometimes love means making room for someone to grow, even when it changes the shape of our own days. Miriam did not lose her place in Scout and Nell's lives. Mason did not simply take responsibility from her. And Huxley, old and slower now, reminded them all that a quiet presence can still lead people exactly where grace needs them to go. Maybe there is someone in your life who does not need a perfect answer today. Maybe they only need you to sit beside them long enough to understand what they are trying to carry. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about an animal, a neighbor, or a small act of kindness that helped you through a lonely season. And if you enjoy stories of loyalty, hope, and the quiet ways God brings people together, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. May your home be filled with peace, and may you never miss the small miracles waiting at your door.